The alley smelled of iron and smoke. Blood stained the walls in wide, chaotic strokes, as though someone had painted a warning with human life itself. On the cracked pavement below, the silence was broken only by the faint buzzing of streetlights and the occasional bark of a stray dog. Spray painted across the brick, in jagged black letters, were the words every resident of the neighborhood feared most: MS-13. But this wasn't just another gang killing. Whispers spread quickly through the community. A woman had ordered it. Name carried through the streets like a curse. Parents pulled their children inside at dusk, and neighbors crossed the street rather than risk speaking her name too loudly. She wasn't just a part of MS-13. She wasn't someone's girlfriend or sister, dragged unwillingly into violence. No, she commanded fear. She had risen in the ranks of a gang known for machetes, fire, and unflinching brutality. And now, she stood at the center of a story that blurred the line between survival and monstrosity. For decades, MS-13 has been portrayed as a brotherhood of ruthless men, tattooed faces, cold stares, and an iron grip on the communities they rule. But what happens when women, often thought of only as victims in this world, take power for themselves? What happens when they don't just join the gang but redefine the way it spreads fear? The truth is stranger and far more terrifying than most people know. Behind the headlines and sensational images, there exists a darker narrative. Women who transformed their pain into power, their vulnerability into violence. Their crimes weren't acts of blind loyalty to boyfriends or brothers. They weren't background characters in the theater of MS-13 terror. They were leaders, manipulators, and executioners in their own right. Take Marisol, whispered about as La Brucha, the witch. She wasn't born violent, but the world carved her into someone unrecognizable. Her reputation grew not from her beauty or charm, but from the way rivals begged for mercy in her presence, and the cold, unblinking eyes with which she denied it. Or Karla, remembered as La Novia Negra, the Black Bride. She entered MS-13 not through fear, but through love, and intoxicating, forbidden love with one of the gang's rising stars. But when he was killed, something in her broke. Her grief didn't lead her away from blood, it drew her into it. And then there was Isabel, known simply as La Reina, the Queen. Unlike the others, she didn't rely on violence alone. She relied on intelligence, on manipulation, on the deadly art of playing people against each other. She turned men who thought themselves kings into pawns, and she did it without raising a blade. These women didn't just survive in MS-13, they redefined what it meant to wield fear. Their stories are not the ones you'll see on the evening news. They're buried in case files, whispered about in courtrooms, and retold in shivers by those who remember their reign. So tonight, we open the doors to a darker truth. Beyond the headlines, beyond the stereotypes, lies the untold story of MS-13's most feared women, and we ask the question that still chills every community they touched: what drives a woman to become one of the most feared members of MS-13? To understand how these women rose to power, you have to understand the world that created them. MS-13 wasn't born in Central America, it was born in the streets of Los Angeles. In the 1980s, waves of Salvadoran immigrants fled civil war, only to land in neighborhoods where survival meant forming bonds of protection. The streets of Pico Union and Koreatown became breeding grounds for a new brotherhood, Mata Salvatrucha. At first it was defense, but defense turned to violence, and violence turned into a culture. What started as ragged teenagers fending off bullies grew into one of the most feared gangs in the world, stretching across borders, thriving in prisons, and becoming synonymous with cruelty. 1013's, calling cards, tattooed faces, machetes, public executions became part of global headlines. But behind the images of snarling men with inked foreheads, there was another story simmering. Women. At first, they were treated as accessories. Girlfriends, wives, sometimes trophies passed between high-ranking men. Many were forced into this world, coerced by violence or desperation. Some joined to protect themselves, believing proximity to power might keep them alive. But over time, something shifted. In neighborhoods where poverty crushed every dream, where jobs were scarce and violence was routine, some women chose not just to survive but to climb. They saw in MS-13 what the outside world denied them: power, respect, fear. This is where we meet the three women whose names are now whispered in police files and community gossip. They are not the only women who wielded power in MS-13, but they are among the most feared. Marisol La Bruja. She wasn't born with darkness in her eyes. As a girl, she sang in her church choir, her voice high and hopeful, her mother's pride. But poverty doesn't ask about innocence. When her father abandoned the family, and her mother worked long nights in diners, Marisol learned early what it meant to feel invisible. Later, when abuse carved scars deeper than skin, her faith didn't hold. She stopped praying. She started listening to the voices on the street corners, the ones that promised protection and belonging. By her 20s, Marisol wasn't the girl in the choir. She was La Bruja, the witch known for punishments so cruel they left even hardened gang members shaken. Karla La Novia Negra. Her story was different. Karla didn't crave violence. She craved love. Growing up in a fractured home, love was a language she barely understood. So when she met Javier, a high-ranking MS-13 member with charisma as sharp as a blade, she fell hard. To outsiders, she was just his girl. But when Javier was murdered in a gang feud, Karla changed. Her grief turned to rage, her loyalty turned to vengeance. The girl who once dreamed of family dinners and quiet nights became La Novia Negra, the black bride, a woman in mourning who wore death like a veil. Isabella Reina. If Marisol was violence and Karla was vengeance, Isabel was calculation. She wasn't drawn in by poverty or by love, she was drawn in by power itself. Ambitious and coldly intelligent, Isabel studied the men around her. She knew their weaknesses, their jealousies, their secrets. She rose not by fighting with blades, but by playing with minds. She whispered, manipulated, seduced, and betrayed until even the most feared men looked over their shoulders when she entered a room. They called her La Reina, the queen, because she built her empire the way a chess master plays a board, sacrificing pawns and knights to corner kings. Each woman carried a void inside her. Marisol's void was loneliness and trauma. Karla's was grief and betrayal. Isabel's was hunger for dominance in a world that told her she was powerless, and MS-13 gave them what life had denied them, a stage on which to turn emptiness into influence. But here is the twist that unsettles every community, where their shadows still linger. These women weren't just passive players in a melt gang. They weren't victims chained to someone else's choices. They became architects of terror. They rewrote the rules of fear, showing that violence has no gender. And as their names spread, La Bruja, La Novia Negra, La Reina, so did the terror. For some, they were legends. For others, nightmares. But for everyone who lived under their reign, one truth remained clear. When women embraced the darkness of MS-13, the streets learned fear in a new and unexpected form. Marisol's descent, from victim to enforcer. Marisol's transformation didn't happen overnight. At first, she was pushed into the shadows, ordered around by men who saw her only as disposable. But trauma, when it festers, can become its own weapon. The abuse she endured carved out a place inside her, a hollow space that no comfort could fill. And when she was finally handed a blade, she found purpose in using it. Her reputation began with whispers. She didn't just carry out punishments, she designed them. A rival caught stealing wasn't simply beaten. Under Marisol's orders, he was humiliated, scarred in ways that made every glance in the mirror a reminder of who truly held power. Each act of cruelty fed something inside her. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't the powerless girl who had once begged for mercy. She was La Bruja, and the streets trembled when her name was spoken. Yet behind the mask, there were moments alone, staring into a broken mirror, when Marisol's hands shook. Did she feel strength, or was she simply pouring her pain into others? Was this her revenge against the world, or had she become the very thing she once feared? Karla's forbidden love, grief into revenge. Karla's descent was rooted in something almost tender, love. She and Javier had kept their relationship hidden, meeting in secret corners, sharing stolen hours. In the eyes of the gang, women like her were ornaments, never partners. But to Javier, she was different, or so she believed. When Javier was ambushed and gunned down, Karla's world cracked open. She didn't cry in public. She didn't mourn openly. Instead, she buried her grief beneath silence, and when she emerged, she was someone else entirely. La Novia Negra was born not from love, but from its ashes. Her revenge was meticulous. She tracked the men who had ordered Javier's death. One by one, they vanished. Sometimes bodies were found in alleys, sometimes not at all. The killings weren't random, they were statements, signatures carved into the gang's collective memory. Soon, members whispered that to cross Karla was to invite your own funeral. And yet, her love story lingered in every act. She wasn't just avenging Javier, she was keeping him alive through violence. Each bullet, each knife wound, was her twisted declaration. I loved him. I will not forgive the world for taking him from me. Isabel's manipulation, the Queen's game asterisk. Where Marisol used fear and Karla used vengeance, Isabel played with people. She understood desire better than anyone, what men wanted, what women feared, what secrets could topple an empire. She seduced rivals not for love, but for information. She whispered half-truths into ears, planting seeds of doubt until brothers turned against each other. Her true weapon wasn't a blade, it was paranoia. Under Isabel's influence, MS-13 cliques began to fracture. Who could be trusted? Who was loyal? Every smile carried suspicion. Every meeting dripped with tension, and Isabel stood in the middle of it all, the silent queen, orchestrating chaos. But her manipulations weren't without cost. Rumors spread. Men who once laughed at the idea of a woman leading began to fear her, and fear breeds resentment. Isabel knew she was climbing higher, but she also knew that one mistake, one betrayal, turned back on her, could end her reign. Tensions rising inside MS-13. The male leaders of MS-13 weren't blind. They saw what was happening. Marisol's brutality, Karla's vengeance, Isabel's mind games. They were reshaping the gang in ways no man had anticipated. Some leaders wanted them silenced, fearing the humiliation of women holding power in their world. Others admired their ruthlessness, even used it for their own ends. The result was instability. Rivalries sharpened, old loyalties crumbled. Friendships turned brittle under the weight of secrets. In one case, Karla avenged Javier by targeting a man Marisol had secretly sworn to protect. The fallout was brutal. Two women once aligned now stood at opposite ends of a blood-soaked feud. Exploring emotional complexity, Joman carried her own justification. Marisol told herself she was reclaiming her stolen childhood. Karla whispered to herself that love demanded blood. Isabel believed power had no gender, that manipulation was survival. But were they reclaiming agency, or were they consumed by darkness? Did they truly choose this path, or did the world corner them until the only exit was through blood? Their inner battles remained hidden, drowned beneath the reputations they carefully cultivated. But those questions haunted the silence between killings, the moments when adrenaline faded and humanity returned. Betrayals and escalations. As power grew, so did betrayal. Friends turned enemies when survival demanded it. Karla, once trusted by her clique, was betrayed by someone she called her sister. Isabel seduced a rival only to discover he was playing her as well, setting off a deadly cycle of double. Even Marisol, whose fearsome reputation seemed untouchable, learned the sting of betrayal when a proto she had trained sold her secrets to police for freedom. Rivals became lovers. Lovers became enemies. Violence escalated not only on the streets but in the shadows of the gang itself. 1000s-13 had always been violent, but now the violence was layered with personal vendettas, with the sharp edge of emotions, grief, jealousy, ambition driving every decision, vulnerability twisted into violence. This was the darkest truth of all. What began as vulnerability, poverty, loneliness, love, abuse was weaponized into terror. Marisol's pain became the reason others screamed. Karla's grief became a cycle of funerals. Isabel's ambition became paranoia that tore families apart. Their insecurities didn't vanish. They were twisted into motives. They didn't heal. They infected everything around them. And as the bodies piled up and fear thickened like smoke, one thing became clear. These women weren't just surviving MS-13. They were reshaping it in their own image, and the gang, already infamous for its brutality, was about to enter an era even more terrifying than before. It began with a name, whispered in Isabel's ear, a man they once trusted, a former ally who had seen too much, heard too much, and now spoke too freely. He wasn't just a risk, he was a threat to everything they had built. Isabel didn't raise her voice, didn't brandish a weapon. She simply gave the order. And when Isabel gave an order, others listened. He has to disappear, she said coldly. The message was clear. This wasn't about punishment. It was about erasing. Marisol didn't hesitate. Violence was her language. To her, Isabel's order was not just necessary, it was inevitable. But Karla lingered in silence, torn. The man marked for death had once been kind to her, once shielded her from suspicion when she was still seen as just Javier's girl. Killing him felt like betraying a memory. Yet loyalty to the women who now defined her life outweighed the ghost of old kindness. The night was chosen carefully, a humid Friday, when the neighborhood was alive with music and chatter, masking the darker movements happening in its alleys. They lured him under the pretense of a meeting. Isabel's specialty was deception, and she spun the lie with precision. By the time he realized he was alone with Marisol and Karla, it was too late. The alley was narrow, boxed in by graffiti-tagged walls. The man's face flickered with recognition and dread as he saw Marisol step forward. She carried no hesitation. In her eyes, only the cold certainty of execution. Karla stood just behind, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering in her ears. He begged, first with logic, then with promises, finally with desperation. "I never meant to betray anyone. I kept your secrets. You know me." But Isabel's voice echoed in their minds. "He has to disappear." Marisol struck first. Her blade was not clean. It was designed for fear as much as for death. The man's cries bled into the night, muffled only by the music echoing from distant windows. Karla watched, frozen, until Marisol turned to her and thrust the knife into her hands. "Do it," Marisol demanded. In that instant, Karla's past and present collided. She saw Javier's face, the boy she once loved, overlapping with the man before her. The weight of her grief, her anger, her revenge pressed down until her hand moved on its own. When the blade cut, when the blood stained her skin, she felt something inside her shatter. Together, they staged the body. It wasn't hidden, it was displayed. Spread across the wall in crimson was the unmistakable mark of MS-13. But this time, whispers said the signature was Femina La Bruja and La Novia Negra. The brutality wasn't just violence, it was theater, a message carved into flesh and stone: "Fear us." The community awoke to horror. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fathers avoided eye contact in the streets. The alley became a forbidden place, a shrine to the unspoken truth that the most feared killers in MS-13 weren't men at all. Police arrived, stunned by the brutality. The wounds weren't random, they were deliberate, symbolic. Detectives whispered among themselves. This was a killing designed not just to silence, but to send a message. The reports didn't say it aloud, but the fear spread anyway. If women were now leading this brand of violence, then even the familiar rules of gang life no longer applied. For Isabel, it was a victory. She never dirtied her hands, but her will had been carried out with ruthless efficiency. For Marisol, it was another act in her theater of cruelty, proof that she was no longer the girl who once prayed for salvation. But for Karla, it was something else entirely. She stood in the alley, staring at her blood-soaked hands. The man's lifeless eyes reflected everything she had lost: Javier, her innocence, her humanity. She had told herself she was killing for love, killing to keep Javier alive in memory. But now, as the metallic smell clung to her clothes, she realized the truth. She wasn't preserving love. She was drowning in hate, knee-deep in blood. She whispered a prayer that didn't sound like prayer at all. It was more like a confession to the night. "I can't go back. I've crossed the point of no return." The inner conflict twisted within each of them. They wanted power, respect, survival. But what they created was terror so raw that entire neighborhoods fell silent when their names were spoken. They had become the storm, and storms do not stop for conscience. Yet even storms leave destruction in their wake. And as the night closed in, the three women, Isabel, the Queen, Marisol, the witch, Karla, the Black Bride, stood at the edge of a line they could never uncross. What began as survival had become domination. What began as pain had become cruelty. What began as love had become death. And the world would never see MS-13 the same way again. The murder in the alley could not be ignored. For weeks, the police had treated killings as routine, another statistic in the endless cycle of MS-13 violence. But this one was different. The wounds were deliberate, the staging theatrical. Detectives pored over photos with grim expressions, each detail telling them this wasn't just gang business, it was a message. And the whispers in the streets told them something even more disturbing. The killers weren't men. At first, the idea was dismissed. A gang as violent as MS-13 had always been portrayed as male-dominated, women little more than shadows behind the soldiers. But as investigators followed the trail, connecting one body to another, a pattern emerged. The hand behind some of the most brutal acts belonged to women. La Bruja, La Reina, La Novia Negra. the names surfaced again and again, muttered in fear by informants who refused to go on record. Police reports shifted tone, no longer just about faceless gunmen, but about women who commanded with brutality, grief, and manipulation. Meanwhile, the community sank deeper into silence. Mothers warned their children never to say the names aloud. Shopkeepers closed early, fearful of retaliation if seen cooperating with police. The very walls seemed to whisper their legends. Graffiti tags of crowns and veils marked territories that once belonged to men. To the locals, these women weren't just criminals. They were phantoms, haunting proof that fear itself had no gender. But inside MS-13, cracks began to show. Power breeds envy, and envy breeds betrayal. Male leaders, once humiliated by the rise of women, began conspiring to bring them down. Isabel, the queen, was the first to be betrayed. A rival she had once manipulated into loyalty turned her name over to the police, feeding them details of her movements in exchange for leniency. She was dragged from a safe house at dawn, her calm face framed by flashing red and blue lights. Maris' capture was messier. She had tried to run, slipping across borders with forged documents, but paranoia had made her reckless. When authorities closed in, she fought with the same ferocity that made her feared. By the time she was subdued, two officers were injured, and her legend only grew. The witch did not surrender easily. Karla's fall was the most tragic. She had tried to escape the cycle, to start anew with another lover far from the gang. But MS-13 doesn't forgive betrayal, even from within. Tracked and cornered, she surrendered without resistance. To the police, she seemed broken, her grief heavier than any chains they placed on her wrists. The trials became a spectacle. Courtrooms filled with reporters, each headline screaming about the female faces of MS-13. Prosecutors painted them as monsters, cold-blooded killers who defied every expectation of womanhood. Defense attorneys countered with a different story: victims of abuse, of poverty, of manipulation by men who had used them as tools. But the evidence spoke louder than arguments. Photographs, testimony, and the sheer brutality of their crimes left juries shaken. Families of victims filled the benches, demanding justice, their sobs cutting through the sterile air of the courtroom. The women's own families sat in silence, faces shadowed by shame. Mothers who once braided their daughters' hair now struggled to reconcile the little girls they raised with the killers described in court. Some refused to attend, unable to bear the weight of both love and horror. When verdicts were delivered, the sentences were long, heavy, unforgiving. Each woman was led away in chains, their names etched into history not as survivors, but as symbols of terror. Yet the emotional consequences lingered beyond the prison walls. Communities fractured, forever scarred by the memory of three women who turned vulnerability into violence. Families mourned not just the lives lost, but the futures stolen. And in the neighborhoods they once ruled, their shadows remained. Whispered warnings carried on the wind: La bruja, la novia negra, la reina. They were gone, but the fear they created lived on. That's 800 words of resolution, covering police shock, community trauma, betrayals, arrests, and courtroom drama with emotional depth. For decades, the stories of gangs like MS-13 have followed a familiar script: men as aggressors, women as collateral. Women were painted as mothers, girlfriends, or silent victims caught in the crossfire of male violence. But the rise of Marisol, Karla, and Isabel shattered that narrative. They weren't just survivors of gang culture, they became its architects of terror. Their lives force us to confront an uncomfortable truth: women, too, can become perpetrators of unimaginable violence. The same hands that once cradled childhood toys now gripped machetes. The same lips that whispered prayers in church became the voices ordering death. This inversion unsettles us because it disrupts the tidy categories of good and evil, victim and oppressor. At the heart of their story lies betrayal. They betrayed family values, turning away from the teachings of mothers and fathers who dreamed of safety and dignity. They betrayed communities that had once nurtured them, transforming neighborhoods into hunting grounds. And most of all, they betrayed themselves, trading innocence for blood. But betrayal alone does not explain their path. Manipulation played its part. Love, for Karla, was the first snare. She fell for a man whose power seemed larger than life, and when death stole him away, grief twisted into vengeance. For Isabel, manipulation was a tool. She used it to climb higher, playing men against one another until her throne was secured. Marisol's manipulation came from trauma itself. Abused and broken, she manipulated fear as both shield and sword, convincing herself that cruelty was her only survival. And so we arrive at the consequence. Lives destroyed. Entire families left grieving, carrying the weight of loss with no end. Communities paralyzed by fear, whispering their names as if speaking them too loudly would summon ghosts. Even behind bars, the women's legacies did not vanish. The blood they spilled seeped too deep into the soil, staining everything they once touched. Yet the moral dilemma lingers, gnawing at us. Did poverty and abuse drive them to darkness? Were they merely products of a world that failed them? Hungry mouths, violent homes, abandoned streets? Or did they make a conscious choice, embracing evil not out of necessity but desire? It is easier to believe in monsters than to admit they were once children who laughed, cried, and dreamed. But perhaps the greatest horror is that both can be true. The story of MS-13's most feared women leaves us with no clean answers. It forces us to look into the abyss of human choice, where love curdles into obsession, trauma hardens into brutality, and survival becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. The world may never fully understand what created them, but their shadows remain in every whispered warning between neighbors, in every scarred wall tagged with reminders of MS-13, and in every family torn apart by the violence they unleashed. And maybe that is the final lesson. Evil does not belong to one gender, one face, or one story. It lingers, shapeless and enduring, carried forward by those willing to embrace it.